You mentioned that in the course of your employment with the Water District, you worked with George Benish. You also mentioned Mike Winters. How would you describe the relationship of George Benish and Mike Winters?
Well, they were friendly. I mean, I think they were personal friends and, you know, business, legal, like assistant general manager or a general manager.
Did you think that they were pretty close?
Yes.
While you worked at the Water District, did you ever get a sense for George's loyalties in terms of whether he might be looking out solely for the Water District's interests or any other person's interests?
Objection, speculation.
I'll allow the question. I think she was around the board and Mr. Benish and us. But again, if you feel as though you can't answer it because you don't really have a knowledge base, just let me know. Okay.
Personally, I thought that George was closer to Mike. He would do what Mike wanted instead of going to the board what they wanted.
Did you have that opinion basically throughout the time you were at the Water District?
Yes.
Is that based on what you were able to oversee in terms of business that was going on at the district and how George Benish would handle that business?
Yes.
George, strike that. Well, you mentioned George Benish's representation ended with the Water District in 2009, right?
Correct.
Is your understanding that the board simply decided they didn't want to use George Benish anymore and wanted other counsel to come in?
Objection, leading.
Well, I think it's a fair question. Ms. Johnson, do you have an understanding as to what happened to cause Mr. Benish to cease to be counsel?
To my recollection, we hired Bingham and Snow as administrative counsel, and we could have still used Mr. Benish as far as for water legal actions.
Do you recall a meeting where the board determined that if George Benish was going to get any more work that it would go through our office?
Correct.
You have an objection?
Objection, both hearsay and speculation and leading. She said what she knew, and now he's feeding her more information to try and get a different answer.
Well, I mean, it seems to me she was pretty close to the situation there at the Water District and at the meetings and had a meaningful role in it all. Had a pretty understanding of how they were dealing with their lawyer. And so this would be consistent with that. If she has an understanding as to any sort of parameters placed upon Mr. Benish's further involvement, she can tell me about it. If she doesn't know, she'll say she doesn't know. Go ahead, Mr. Benish.
So, just so that I'm clear, I don't know if the record's clear on this, but you recall a meeting where the board determined that legal matters would go through my office, and that if we decided, then George Benish would potentially be brought in on some legal matters?
Correct.
Sometime after George Benish, his representation started to kind of taper off or terminate. Mike Winters was also terminated from the Water District, correct?
Correct.
Did you ever have an opportunity to hear George Benish or Mike Winters comment about what was happening with the board's decisions to terminate George Benish's representation and Mike Winters' representation or employment with the Water District?
No, I didn't.
Your Honor, I don't have any more questions at this time for this one.
All right, Mr. Bingham, thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Garnowski.
Ms. Johnson, I think you indicated that you were in charge of payroll as well at Virgin Valley Water District. Is that correct?
Correct.
George Benish, was he paid as an employee of the Virgin Valley Water District, or was he an independent contractor paid via 1099?
He was paid via 1099.
You were asked, you could turn quickly to Exhibit S.
Yes,
I think you said that all of these bills are maintained in the office files at the Virgin Valley Water District, is that correct?
correct.
And these particular billing statements are public records, are they not?
Yes.
Which actually calls for legal conclusion.
If I,
Well, I mean, the question, I think, is that, better asked, do these get put into the record of the public meetings at the Virgin Valley Water District?
Into the meetings?
Well, are they somehow part of the public meetings that you have with the board? These bills?
I do run a report that states that we paid, what vendors we paid, and the amount paid to them. But
Well, maybe that's a good objection, because, I mean, the billing itself, I don't know if she knows if it's part of the public records in a legal sense. So maybe you could just ask her questions designed to get her opinion as to what happens to these billings from the water district's perspective.
if I were to make, you're the person who receives the mail, correct?
correct.
And if I were to submit to you a open records request to obtain copies of these files, the billing statements, would you provide them to me?
On advice of counsel, after they review on what we can give out as public information.
Okay, so you would go to counsel first to determine whether or not these records would be turned over to somebody for a public records request?
Correct.
Did you do the redactions on, if you look on the first page of Exhibit S, a lot of it's blacked out. See that?
Did I do that?
Yes.
No, I did not.
Do you know who did?
I'm taking our attorney's office did.
Did you
but
provide
not
these,
for fact.
did you provide Exhibit S in unredacted form to the attorneys?
Yes,
And likewise with Exhibit NN?
yes.
You retrieved NN from the blue shed
Yes.
at Virgin Valley Water District and provided unredacted version to the attorneys?
Yes,
You said occasionally, if you were listening from your office, if Mr. Winter's door was open and he was on the telephone, that you would be able to hear part of a conversation coming from his office, correct?
I could.
Did you make it a standard practice of listening to Mr. Winter's conversation?
No,
And if Mr. Winters were on the telephone with George Benish, would he typically be on hands-free speakerphone, or would he have the phone up to his ear so you could only hear one side of the conversation?
Mr. Winters he always had the phone up to his ear.
So if you were so inclined and you wanted to listen to a conversation that Mr. Winters was having with Mr. Benish, you wouldn't have ever heard anything that Mr. Benish said, correct?
Correct.
Now, were you so inclined to listen to the conversations that Mr. Benish and Mr. Winters had by telephone in July of 2005 related to a water transaction where Mr. Linetti sold water rights to the Virgin Valley Water District?
No, I did not.
So you have no idea if there were telephone conversations between Mr. Winters and Mr. Benish in 2005 regarding a water transaction with Mr. Linetti. You don't know what they were.
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. And there is a second water rights transaction that is at issue in this litigation that occurred in 2008. Are you aware that in 2008, Virgin Valley Water District and the Southern Nevada Water Authority engaged in a transaction where they exchanged water rights?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Now, do you recall overhearing any conversation between Mr. Winters or Mr. Benish in 2008 that related to that 2008 transaction?
Not that I recall.
And just to close the loop, did Mr. Johnson have an office anywhere near Mr. Winters?
He was down the hall. There were, and no door between them, just opened out to the front hallway.
Was his office close enough for you to overhear telephone conversations that he might have?
No,
So it's fair to say that you never overheard any conversations between Mr. Benish and Mr. Johnson regarding either the 2005 water transaction or the 2008 water transaction?